January 18th, 2026, 9:42, and Prince William sits in his private office at Kensington Palace, reviewing what should be routine coronation planning documents, just preliminary outlines, guest list drafts, ceremonial protocols being updated for a modern reign. But as he flips through the correspondence log, something stops him cold. 3 weeks of meeting minutes, 5 separate planning sessions, dozens of emails coordinating everything from processional routes to ceremonial music selections, and in every single document, one name is conspicuously, deliberately, completely absent. Queen Camilla, not unable to attend, not regrets, not will be briefed separately, just nothing, as if she doesn't exist. William's first thought is that this must be an administrative error. Someone forgot to copy her, a clerical oversight in the massive coordination effort that a coronation requires, but then he sees the signature at the bottom of the Exclusion memo, the authorization that quietly removed Camilla from every planning communication. Princess Anne. And suddenly, William understands. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision, a calculated, institutional decision made without his knowledge, executed with surgical precision, and designed to send a message that couldn't be louder if it had been shouted from the palace balcony. His aunt, the woman he trusts more than almost anyone in the royal family, has effectively banned his stepmother from participating in the planning of his own coronation. And according to sources who were present when William made this discovery, his reaction was one word, repeated twice, each time with increasing disbelief. What? Within the hour, he would demand a meeting with Anne. Within 2 hours, Camilla would find out. And within 6 hours, the sound of her screaming at King Charles would echo through Clarence House so loudly that staff members 3 rooms away would later describe it as the most furious we've ever heard her. Now, before we go any further, I need to be absolutely clear about something. What I'm about to tell you is based on leaked palace documents, insider testimonies from people who were present during key meetings, and sources close to multiple members of the royal family. None of this has been officially confirmed by Buckingham Palace or Kensington Palace in any public statement. But multiple independent sources with no connection to each other across different royal households are all telling the same story with remarkably consistent details. If even half of what's being reported is accurate, we're not just talking about a family disagreement, we're talking about a fundamental power shift within the British monarchy, one where Princess Anne has positioned herself as the institutional gatekeeper, where Prince William is discovering that decisions about his own future are being made without his input, and where Queen Camilla is learning that the title she fought decades to achieve might not actually carry the authority she thought it did. So let's start from the beginning, because this story doesn't start on January 18th when William discovered the exclusion. It starts 3 months earlier in October 2025 with a conversation between Princess Anne and a very small group of trusted advisors about what she called the Camilla problem. October 2025, Gatcombe Park, Gloucestershire. Princess Anne's private residence. According to sources who've been briefed on what happened, Anne convened what she called an institutional review meeting. Not a family gathering, not a social occasion, an institutional review. The language was deliberate. Present were 3 people. Anne herself, a senior constitutional advisor who'd served the late Queen Elizabeth II, and a long-time palace protocol officer who'd been involved in every major royal event for the past 30 years. The topic, according to sources, assessing appropriate roles and boundaries for the coronation of the Prince of Wales. But within 15 minutes, the real subject became clear: how to limit Camilla's involvement without creating a public scandal. Anne, according to these sources, laid out her concerns with characteristic bluntness. She didn't attack Camilla personally. She didn't dredge up ancient history about the affair or the divorce or the public relations rehabilitation. She focused on something much more immediate and much more concrete: recent behaviour. According to the constitutional advisor who was present, Anne cited 7 specific incidents over the previous 6 months where Camilla had, in Anne's words, overstepped her constitutional position. One involved Camilla attempting to influence the guest list for a Commonwealth reception. suggesting certain dignitaries be excluded based on what Anne saw as personal preference rather than diplomatic protocol. Another involved Camilla proposing changes to the order of service for a memorial event, change that would have elevated her position in the ceremony beyond what her role as consort traditionally allowed. A third involved Camilla giving an interview to a major publication where she spoke about shaping the future of the monarchy in ways that Anne felt implied decision-making authority she didn't actually possess. These weren't scandalous moments. They weren't tabloid-worthy incidents. They were subtle, incremental expansions of perceived authority. Small boundary pushes that individually might seem insignificant. But Anne saw a pattern, and patterns in institutional terms become precedents, and precedents once established become very difficult to reverse. If we allow this trajectory to continue, Anne reportedly said, by the time William is crowned, she'll expect to be treated as a co-equal rather than a consort, and that fundamentally undermines the constitutional structure of the monarchy. The protocol officer, according to sources, initially pushed back. Surely this could be handled through quiet conversations, gentle reminders, diplomatic boundary setting, but Anne had apparently already tried that approach multiple times. And Camilla, whether intentionally or through genuine misunderstanding of her role, had continued to push, so Anne proposed something more definitive. Camilla would be excluded from coronation planning entirely. Not as punishment, not as public humiliation, but as institutional boundary setting. A clear message that consort does not mean co-monarch. The constitutional advisor, according to sources, asked the obvious question, does the Prince of Wales know about this proposal? Anne's response, as reported, not yet, but he will support it once he understands the constitutional necessity. That assumption, as it turned out, was about to be tested. Because while Anne was operating on the principle of institutional preservation, William was operating on something much more personal, fairness, family cohesion, and a deep discomfort with being the centre of conflicts he didn't create. November 2025. Kensington Palace. According to sources, Princess Anne requested a private meeting with Prince William. No staff, no advisors, no Catherine, just the two of them. The meeting lasted 47 minutes, and while we don't have a recording or a transcript, multiple sources have confirmed the general outline of what was discussed based on briefings from both sides. Anne laid out her case methodically. She showed William documentation of the incidents she'd cited to her advisors. She explained her concerns about precedent and institutional structure. She emphasised that this wasn't about personal dislike or family drama. It was about protecting the constitutional integrity of his future reign. And then she made her recommendation. Camilla should be excluded from coronation planning meetings. Not from the coronation itself. She would obviously attend as Queen Consort. But from the strategic planning, the decision-making, the behind-the-scenes work that shapes how a coronation is structured and what it symbolises. William, according to sources, was initially sceptical, not because he disagreed with Anne's concerns. He'd noticed some of the same boundary issues himself. But because he worried about the family dynamics, about his father's reaction, about whether this would create more problems than it solved, he asked Anne, have you discussed this with my father? Anne's response has reported, your father's loyalty is divided. Mine is not. My loyalty is to the institution and to your future, in that order. It was a stunning admission. Anne was essentially saying that she didn't trust King Charles to make objective decisions when it came to his wife. That emotional attachment had compromised his institutional judgment. William, according to sources, asked for time to think. Anne agreed. But she also made one thing clear. The planning begins in earnest after Christmas. If we're going to set this boundary, it needs to happen before the first official meeting. Once she's included, excluding her later becomes the story. If she's never included, it's simply protocol. The meeting ended without a firm decision. But Anne had planted the seed, and over the next several weeks, as William watched Camilla continue to insert herself into conversations about our coronation and how we should approach various ceremonial elements, the seed began to grow. By early January 2026, William had made his decision. He didn't tell Anne directly, but he simply didn't object when the first planning documents began circulating without Camilla's name on the distribution list. His silence was his consent. And Princess Anne, interpreting that silence as authorization, moved forward with systematic efficiency, and every meeting invitation, every briefing memo, every planning session, Camilla's name was nowhere to be found. For 3 weeks, it worked perfectly. Planning moved forward at Kensington Palace. Anne attended some sessions in person, participated in others via a secure video conference. William was deeply involved, making decisions about everything from the symbolic meaning of various ceremonial elements to the guest list priorities. Catherine participated as well, offering input on how to make the ceremony feel accessible to younger generations while respecting tradition. Her suggestions about incorporating more diverse Commonwealth representation and highlighting service rather than pageantry were enthusiastically received. The planning was progressing exactly as Anne had hoped: focused, efficient, constitutionally appropriate, and most importantly, free from the boundary complications that Camilla's presence would have introduced. But there was one significant problem that nobody had fully anticipated. Camilla had staff. And staff talk. January 15th, 2026, Clarence House. According to sources, one of Camilla's private secretaries was reviewing her calendar, trying to coordinate her schedule with upcoming royal events. The coronation was obviously going to be the most significant event of the year, so planning around it required careful coordination. But as the secretary tried to get information about key planning dates, she kept hitting walls. Nobody seemed to know when Camilla was expected at meetings. Or rather, they knew, but they weren't saying. Finally, the secretary reached out to a contact at Kensington Palace, a friend, someone she'd worked with for years, and asked directly, "When is the Queen Consort expected at the next coronation planning session?" The response has reported, "I don't think she's on the list." Which list? Any of them. That's when the secretary realised this wasn't a scheduling oversight. This was intentional exclusion. She immediately reported back to Camilla, and Camilla, according to sources, initially didn't believe it. Surely there must be some mistake. Surely she would have been informed if she was being excluded from planning her husband's son's coronation. But as her staff made more inquiries, the pattern became impossible to deny. Meeting minutes existed that she'd never seen. Planning documents had been circulated that she'd never received. Decisions had been made about ceremonial elements that directly affected her role as consort, and she'd never been consulted. According to sources close to Camilla, her initial reaction was confusion rather than anger. She genuinely didn't understand what was happening or why. Had she done something wrong? Was this some kind of protocol she wasn't aware of? Was there a constitutional reason consorts weren't involved in coronation planning? She asked her most senior advisor to research historical precedent, and what they found only made the situation more troubling. When King George VI was crowned in 1937, Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, was deeply involved in planning. When Queen Elizabeth II was crowned in 1953, Prince Philip wasn't involved in strategic planning. But that was because consorts traditionally weren't. But consorts who were queens, they had historically been part of the conversation. So this wasn't protocol. This was a choice. Someone had decided to exclude her, and she wanted to know who and why. On January 16th, Camilla requested a meeting with King Charles. According to sources, she approached it calmly, presenting the evidence her staff had gathered, and asking Charles if he knew anything about why she was being excluded. Charles, according to these sources, was blindsided. He'd been kept out of the loop entirely. Anne hadn't discussed it with him. William hadn't mentioned it. He'd assumed incorrectly that coronation planning was proceeding with all the appropriate people involved. His response to Camilla, as reported, "Let me look into this." That same afternoon, Charles called Prince William. This conversation was described by sources as tense but controlled. Charles was asked directly, "Is Camilla being excluded from coronation planning?" William's response, according to sources, "It's being handled at the institutional level by Anne." "Did you know about this?" A pause, then, "Yes." "And you approved it." Another pause, longer, then, "I didn't object." Charles, according to sources, felt the weight of that distinction. William hadn't actively made the decision, but he'd passively allowed it, which meant Anne was operating with William's implicit consent, even if not his explicit authorization. Charles's next question: why wasn't I consulted? William's response, as reported, was careful but firm. Because Anne felt your judgment on this matter might be complicated by personal considerations. I suppose it was a diplomatic way of saying, we didn't trust you to be objective about your wife. The conversation ended shortly after, not with an argument, not with a resolution, just with both men understanding that a line had been drawn and they were on opposite sides of it. And that night, when Charles told Camilla what he'd learned, that William had known and hadn't stopped it, that Anne had orchestrated it deliberately, and that nobody had thought to consult him or her until after it was already in motion, Camilla's confusion transformed into something much more volatile. Rage, January 17th, 2026, Clarence House, approximately 8:30 p.m. According to multiple sources, including household staff who were present in the building, Camilla confronted Charles in his private study. The doors were closed, but the soundproofing in Clarence House was never designed to contain the kind of fury that followed. Staff members 3 rooms away reported hearing Camilla's voice, not the words, but the unmistakable sound of screaming. Loud, sustained, furious screaming. One staff member later told investigators, the palace quietly investigated the leak afterward, that it was the angriest I've ever heard Her Majesty in all my years of service. According to sources who've been briefed on what was said, Camilla didn't hold back. She unleashed years of frustration, accumulated slights, and institutional humiliation that she'd quietly endured in her climb from mistress to wife to queen consort. She reportedly screamed about Anne. That woman has hated me from the beginning. She's never accepted me. She's never given me a chance. And now she's trying to erase me from the most important moment of your son's life. She screamed about William. He's supposed to be family. I've tried to support him. I've tried to be there for his children. And this is how he repays me, by letting his aunt humiliate me. But most devastatingly, according to sources, she screamed at Charles himself. You're the king! You're supposed to protect me. You're supposed to stand up for me. But you're so afraid of upsetting William and Anne that you let them treat me like I don't matter. Anne then, according to one source who was briefed on the confrontation, do something, Charles. For once in your life, do something. Charles, according to all accounts, tried to calm her, tried to explain that this was complicated, that there were constitutional considerations, that he needed to handle this carefully. But Camilla wasn't interested in careful. She wasn't interested in constitutional nuance. She was interested in being treated with the respect she felt her title demanded. I am queen, she reportedly shouted. Queen, not a guest, not an accessory, not someone they can just ignore when it's convenient. The argument continued for nearly an hour, and when it finally ended, according to sources, Camilla delivered an ultimatum. Either you fix this or I will, and I promise you, Charles, you won't like how I fix it. She left the room. Charles sat alone in his study until well past midnight, and the next morning he made a decision that would set off the next phase of this crisis. He would try to intervene, not forcefully, not publicly, but quietly, through back channels, he would attempt to have Camilla reinstated into the planning process. It was exactly the move Princess Anne had predicted he would make, and she was already prepared for it. January 19th, 2026, Windsor Castle. King Charles requested a private meeting with Princess Anne. No staff, no advisors, just brother and sister, talking about family and duty in the way they'd done for decades. The meeting took place in a small sitting room that had once belonged to their mother. A deliberate choice by Charles, sources suggest, meant to invoke Queen Elizabeth II's memory and the values she represented. Charles began, according to sources, by acknowledging Anne's concerns about institutional boundaries. He agreed that Camilla had perhaps been too eager to take on visible roles. He understood the importance of maintaining constitutional clarity. But then he made his case for inclusion. Camilla was his wife. She was queen consort. She would be present at the coronation, standing beside him, visible to the world. How would it look if she had no understanding of the planning? no context for the decisions, no input into a ceremony where she would play a significant role. He argued that exclusion now would create problems later, that she would feel blindsided during rehearsals, that the lack of coordination would be noticeable, that this was creating a family rift that didn't need to exist. And then he asked Anne directly, as her brother, not as her king, please reconsider. Please bring her back into the process. I'll ensure she understands the boundaries. I'll make sure she doesn't overstep. But please don't humiliate her this way. Anne's response, according to sources who've been briefed on the conversation, was measured but absolute. This isn't about humiliation, Charles. This is about clarity. Camilla is Queen Consort. That is the title, not a role. Her function at the coronation is symbolic presence, not strategic input. And the sooner she understands that, the better for everyone. Charles tried another approach. She's family. Anne's response, so is William, and his future is more important than her feelings. That's cruel. No, that's duty. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the outcome never changed. Anne would not budge. She had William's tacit support. She had constitutional precedent on her side, and she had no intention of reversing a decision she believed was fundamentally correct. Charles left the meeting having accomplished nothing, and that failure, sources say, sent him into a spiral of frustration and self-doubt that would last for days, because he was caught in an impossible position. As a husband, he wanted to defend his wife. As a father, he didn't want to alienate his son. As a monarch, he was supposed to be the ultimate authority. But in practice, he was discovering that his authority was increasingly theoretical. William was the future, Anne was the enforcer. And together, they were shaping the monarchy's direction, whether Charles agreed or not. That realisation, according to sources close to the king, was devastating. He'd waited his entire life to be monarch. And now that he finally wore the crown, he was learning that power in the British royal family doesn't flow from titles. It flows from respect, from strategic positioning, and from the willingness to make hard decisions without flinching. Anne had that willingness. William was developing it. And Charles, kind-hearted and conflict-averse, simply didn't. Meanwhile, back at Clarence House, Camilla was making her own plans. Because if Charles wouldn't fight for her, she would fight for herself. January 21st, 2026, undisclosed location, London. According to sources, Camilla met privately with a senior public relations advisor, someone who'd worked with her during the long rehabilitation of her public image. Someone who understood media strategy and knew how to craft narratives. The meeting, sources say, focused on one question. How could Camilla regain her position without creating a public scandal? The advisor reportedly outlined several options. A carefully placed interview expressing hurt feelings about being excluded from family planning. A series of high-profile public appearances demonstrating her value to the monarchy. Strategic leaks to sympathetic journalists about the internal divisions at the palace. But every option carried risks. If she went public, she might gain sympathy, but she'd also expose the rift. If she stayed silent, she'd maintain dignity, but she'd remain excluded. Camilla, according to sources, was leaning towards a middle path. Selective visibility. Appear at events. Be photographed looking engaged and regal. Remind the public and the institution why she matters. Don't attack William or Anne directly, but make their exclusion of her look petty and unnecessary through contrast. It was a strategy born of decades navigating hostile public opinion. Don't fight the palace directly. Make them look bad by looking good yourself. But before Camilla could fully implement this approach, another development changed the dynamics entirely. Because while Charles was trying to negotiate and Camilla was planning her comeback, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was quietly stepping into the exact space Camilla had been denied. January 23rd, 2026, Kensington Palace. According to sources present at coronation planning meetings, Catherine had been attending sessions from the beginning. But in late January, her role shifted from participant to co-leader. She wasn't just offering suggestions anymore, she was making decisions. Alongside William and with Anne's full support, Catherine was shaping everything from the visual aesthetics of the ceremony to the symbolic messaging it would convey. One planning session, sources report, focused on the procession route. the traditional path versus the modified route that would pass through more diverse neighbourhoods of London. William was inclined toward tradition and saw the value in symbolism, but worried about security complications. Catherine reportedly broke the stalemate with a simple observation: the monarchy survives by evolving. This coronation needs to show we understand whose country this is, not just the pasts, the futures. The modified route was approved. Another session dealt with the coronation oath. Historical language versus updated phrasing that would feel more inclusive to modern Britain. Again, debate. Again, Catherine provided the deciding perspective. The words matter less than the sincerity, she reportedly said. But if we're asking people to believe in this institution, we need to speak their language, not just our ancestors. William, according to everyone present, deferred to her judgment repeatedly, not because he lacked opinions, but because he trusted her instincts about public sentiment in ways he didn't quite trust his own. And gradually something remarkable was happening. Catherine was becoming the de facto queen consort, not in title, but in function. She was doing exactly what Camilla had been excluded from doing, and she was doing it with Anne's blessing and William's partnership. The contrast was devastating for Camilla because it made Anne's decision look less like institutional prejudice and more like practical judgment. Catherine wasn't being excluded. Catherine was thriving. The difference wasn't the role. It was a threshold. It was the person. By late January, word of Catherine's elevated involvement had reached Camilla. And according to sources, that's when her rage shifted from diffuse frustration to focused resentment. This wasn't just about Anne anymore. This was about being replaced, being made obsolete before she'd even had the chance to prove her value. January 28th, 2026, Clarence House. Camilla confronted Charles again. This time, according to sources, she was calmer, but calm in a dangerous way. The kind of calm that comes after anger has crystallised into determination. Catherine is doing the job I should be doing, she reportedly said, and you're letting it happen. Charles tried to explain that Catherine's role was different, that she was William's wife, that her involvement made sense, but Camilla wasn't having it. The coronation is about your succession, your son, your family, and I'm your wife. But I'm being treated like a stranger while Catherine plans the ceremony that's supposed to honour your legacy. She demanded that Charles take action, not ask, not negotiate. Take action, use his authority as king to override Anne's decision and reinstate her into the planning process. And Charles, according to sources, finally attempted to do exactly that. January 30th, 2026, Buckingham Palace. King Charles issued what sources describe as a strongly worded request to Prince William. Not a command, he was too careful for that, but more than a suggestion, a request from a father and king that Camilla be brought into at least some coronation planning discussions. The response came within 3 hours, not from William, from Anne. A single-page memo delivered to Charles's office outlining constitutional precedent for consort involvement in coronation planning, citing specific examples from the last 200 years and concluding with a paragraph that, according to sources, made Charles physically wince when he read it. The Queen Consort's role is ceremonial presence, not strategic input. This has been the standard for centuries and remains appropriate today. The Prince of Wales's coronation planning is proceeding in accordance with institutional guidelines and with the full support of those constitutionally positioned to provide governance oversight. In other words, your wife has no constitutional right to be involved. We're following proper protocol. And if you push this, we'll make it a constitutional issue rather than a family one. Charles recognised the trap. If he pushed harder, Anne would frame it as a king interfering with his heir's autonomous planning. It would make Charles look controlling and Camilla look grasping. The optics would be terrible. He was cornered, and he knew it. That night, Charles told Camilla that he'd tried and failed, that Anne had outmanoeuvred him, that William was supporting Anne's position and that there was nothing more he could do without creating a constitutional crisis. Camilla's response, according to sources, was cold and final. Then I'll remember this: when they need something from me, when they want me to smile and wait and play my part, I'll remember that they only value me when it's convenient. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. The relationship between Camilla and the future reign had been fundamentally damaged, and everyone knew it. February 3rd, 2026, Buckingham Palace. In an attempt to manage the fallout and prevent further leaks, the palace issued a brief statement. Carefully worded, deliberately vague, it acknowledged ongoing coronation planning and thanked all senior royals for their continued support and cooperation. Camilla's name was mentioned once in a generic list of family members. Catherine's name appeared twice, once in connection with planning and once in connection with public engagement strategy. Royal commentators immediately noted the disparity. The statement was supposed to calm things down. Instead, it confirmed what everyone suspected. Camilla had been sidelined, and the palace wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Media coverage intensified. Speculation about rifts within the family dominated headlines for a week. But through it all, the palace maintained absolute silence about specifics. No one would confirm or deny Anne's role. No one would explain the exclusion criteria. No one would address whether Camilla had protested or Charles had intervened. The strategy was classic royal opacity: acknowledge nothing, explain nothing, and wait for the news cycle to move on. But inside the palace, the damage was done. The firm had split into clear factions: Anne, William and Catherine on one side, Charles and Camilla on the other, and between them a gulf that might never be fully bridged. February 10th, 2026, present day. As coronation planning continues, one truth has become undeniable. Princess Anne has fundamentally reshaped the power dynamics of the British monarchy. She didn't do it through scandal or publicity. She did it through institutional knowledge, strategic positioning, and the willingness to make decisions that others found too difficult. William's coronation, when it comes, will be unmistakably modern, shaped by Catherine's understanding of public sentiment, guided by Anne's institutional rigour, and executed with a clarity of purpose that previous transitions often lacked. Camilla will be there, of course. She'll stand beside Charles. She'll wear her crown and her ceremonial robes. She'll smile for the cameras and play her part. But she'll know, and everyone watching will know, that she had no hand in creating any of it, that the ceremony was designed without her input, planned without her presence, and executed despite her objections. For William, the discovery of Anne's actions created a complicated legacy. He gained a coronation planned with precision and free from the boundary complications Camilla brought. But he also inherited a family rift that may define the early years of his reign. For Charles, the entire episode has been a painful lesson in the limits of monarchy. He wears the crown, but Anne wields the institutional power. He loves his wife, but his family has made clear that love doesn't trump protocol. And for Camilla, the rage she unleashed at Charles that night in January has settled into something harder and more lasting: resentment. She'll never forgive Anne for the exclusion. She'll never trust William fully again. And she'll never forget that when she needed Charles to fight for her, his power proved hollow. The British monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years by adapting while appearing unchanging, by making hard decisions while maintaining graceful facades, by choosing institutional preservation over individual comfort. Princess Anne's decision to ban Camilla from coronation planning was exactly that kind of survival instinct in action. Ruthless but rational, cold but constitutional, personal in impact but institutional in purpose. Whether history judges it as necessary evolution or cruel exclusion will depend on what comes next, on whether William's reign thrives or struggles, on whether the monarchy Anne fought to protect proves worth the family bonds sacrificed to preserve it. But for now, in February 2026, the verdict is clear. In the battle between sentiment and structure, structure won. Anne chose the institution over the individual. William accepted that choice. Catherine benefited from it. Charles couldn't prevent it. And Camilla will carry the wound forever. The coronation planning continues, the family fracture deepens, and the monarchy, ancient and adaptable, moves forward as it always has, leaving behind those who couldn't keep pace with its cold, calculated evolution.